Welcome back to another episode of Bloodstained Backstories. I'm your host, Jace, and today we have a tragic story from Springfield, Oregon. Now, before we get too far into this episode, I must warn you that the content you are about to listen to may be disturbing to some audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Kipland Philip Kinkel is the second child of William and Faith Kinkel. His parents were both Spanish teachers, and his mom, Faith, taught Spanish at Springfield High School, and his father, William, taught at Thurston High School and Lane Community College. Now, William had retired 3 years before our tragic incident took place, and his mom, Faith, was still teaching. Now, in the family, there is some history of mental illness on both sides of the family. Faith and William concealed this from psychologists, and it was only uncovered when investigators who were hired by Kipland's lawyers discovered this. If you knew there was some history of family illness and you're talking to psychologists, that is not something that I would want to hide. That is actually key information, because the psychologist then could take that information, even if they don't actually do anything with it, they are aware of it, and that does play into some of the sessions that they may have then. However, his parents didn't seem to think so. Now, according to all of the accounts, his parents were both loving and supportive, except for the fact that they hid important information from psychologists. In school, his teachers said that he was immature and he lacked physical and emotional development. And based on one of the recommendations of his teachers, his parents had him repeat the first grade. Now, in Florida, we deal with retentions a lot, especially in third grade. We have the mandatory retention for children who do not pass the state exam. And then as students go on to ninth grade, if they have not passed all of the eighth grade requirements, they technically are retained in eighth grade. And there are pros and cons to both of these things. Some people argue that retention is terrible and detrimental to children, and some people argue that it's helpful because the child clearly wasn't ready to move on and would be further behind if they did move on. So really, retention is kind of one of those sticky areas that it probably works for some and is extremely beneficial for some, and then others not so much. And there's a lot of other factors that go into things too. You know, student motivation, whatnot, does play into the grades. Just because someone's failing something doesn't necessarily always mean it is a true indication of their ability if they didn't have the motivation to do it, so they half-assed did it, and that doesn't really reflect what the child is capable of. Now, during that year that he repeated first grade, he was diagnosed with dyslexia, and that became worse. And ultimately, he was placed in some special education classes by the beginning of second grade. Even from a young age, Kipland had an interest in firearms and explosives, and that continued to develop as he continued to develop as a young man. He began making bombs, mostly gasoline-based, and detonating them in a nearby quarry. Red flag number one for sure. That's not a normal childhood thing. Most children are out, playing video games, not making bombs. William initially wanted to discourage his son from violence, but later enrolled him in a gun safety course, buying him a 9mm Glock and eventually a .22 caliber rifle at the age of 15. I don't know that I would have done that as a parent, knowing his history. I understand the gun safety course as perhaps a mean of trying to teach him how to appropriately use a gun. I guess if, he's going to do it anyways, maybe teach him the right way. But I don't know that I would have bought him two different types of guns either. I would have maybe used a family gun and taught him how to use it appropriately, but then not actually physically given him his own gun, let alone two. They also passed down to him a .22 single-shot rifle when he was 12. So from a young age, this boy had access to weapons and clearly was not using his abilities to the most appropriate way. His mother was not initially happy about these purchases, but a psychologist gave her the emotional permission to say yes, and then Kipland and his father would go target practice shooting near their home. Now, again, had the psychologist known about Kipland's past, more than likely he would have not given mom the emotional permission to say yes. But this is what happens when you don't be honest with your psychologist, so they don't necessarily make the best informed decisions when they can't have all of the information to make that informed decision. So again, this is where lying to the psychologist or not being truthful comes to bite them in the ass. Now, some of his classmates described Kipland as strange and morbid, and others described him as psychotic or schizoid. He was constantly talking about committing acts of violence, telling friends that he wanted to join the army after he graduated, just so he could find out what it was like to kill people. Not the reason most people join the army. Most people do it to serve their country and help people, not necessarily to kill people. His parents did enroll him in an anger management course, and he was evaluated by a psychologist. Over the period of 6 months, he was diagnosed with depression and began a prescription for Prozac. 8 weeks later, Kipland and his mother and the psychologist agreed that he was doing well enough to stop the sessions. No. I mean, 8 weeks, that's not really much time to show change, especially when you're on medication. It typically takes at least 2 to 3 weeks for the medication to fully get in your body. But we'll go with that. And guess what happened after the sessions? They stopped refilling his prescription. Bad idea. This eventually caused Kipland to become paranoid and have delusions, believing that the government was implanting a computer chip in his brain and the Chinese were going to invade the West Coast. Side effects of abruptly stopping medication versus weaning him off of it in slower and slower doses. He described 3 voices that were in his head. Voice A, who commanded him to commit violent acts. Voice B, who repeated insulting and depressive statements at Kipland's expense, and Voice C, who echoed what A and B said. He claimed that he felt punished by God for being subjected to these voices, and it was Voice A who instigated later attacks. Kipland exhibited signs of paranoid schizophrenia, to the full extent of which became apparent when he went on trial. He had gone to great lengths to hide any symptoms because he didn't want to be labeled as abnormal or, quote, mentally retarded, being disliked by girls or institutionalized. Which I understand, as a teenager, you want to fit in and you want to do well, but if your parents had known these things, you could have gotten the proper help, and we will not be in this situation that we are going to talk about in just a little bit. After the tragic event happened, examining psychologists heard about the voices in his head that he had been hearing since he was 12 years old. 12! The voices would constantly be telling him to consider self-harm, and as a means of suppressing that and not doing it, he would play loud music on his headphones or go ride his bike. Now, let's talk about some of the events that led up to this night that we are going to talk about. On May 20th, 1998, Kipland was suspended after being found in possession of a loaded, stolen handgun on school grounds. A friend of Kipland's had stolen the pistol from another friend and arranged to sell it to Kipland the night before. He put the gun, which was loaded with 9 magazine rounds, in a paper bag and left it in his locker. When the gun's owner discovered the theft, he reported to police and supplied the names of students whom he believed might have stolen the firearm. Kipland was not one of them, though. When the school became aware of Kipland's possible involvement and questioned him, it was reported that he stated, "Look, I'm going to be square with you guys. The gun's in my locker." At least he was honest about that. But Kipland was suspended pending an expulsionary hearing, and he and the friend were both arrested. Kipland was released to police custody and driven home by his father when he would be told that he was going to be sent to military school if he did not improve his behavior, because that's going to fix things. When his father lectured him while driving home from the police station, Kipland said the voices in his head were so loud that he was unable to hear anything his father said. Now, here's where it is going to get a little gruesome. So again, this information that you are about to hear may not be for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Later that day, Kipland would murder his parents. Shortly before his death, William, the father, confided to friends that he was terrified and he was running out of options to help his son. And according to Kipland's taped confession, at about 3 p.m. that day, he retrieved a Ruger semi-automatic rifle from his bedroom and ammunition from his parents' bedroom. He went to the kitchen and shot his father once in the back of the head. Then he drugged the body into the bathroom and covered it with a sheet. His mother did not arrive home until about 6:30 p.m. and he met her in the garage. He told her he loved her and he shot her 6 times. Twice in the back of the head, 3 times in the face, and once in the heart. Then he drug her body across the floor and covered it with a sheet. Kipland left a note on the coffee table in the living room, and he described his motive for killing his parents as, "I've just got 2 felonies on my records. My parents can't take that, and it would destroy them. The embarrassment would be too much for them, and they couldn't live with themselves." But as the note continues, he attempted to describe his mental state, and that's when he mentions the voices in his head. "My head just doesn't work right. God damn these voices inside my head. I have to kill people. I don't know why. I have no other choice." Kipland goes to bed and gets up for school the next day. On May 21st, Kipland drives his mother's vehicle to his high school. He wore a trench coat to hide 5 weapons that he carried: 2 hunting knives, his rifle, a Glock pistol, and a .22 Ruger pistol. He was carrying 1,127 rounds of ammunition. Kipland parked 2 blocks from the high school, then jogged to the campus and entered a patio area. And there he fired 2 shots, fatally wounding 16-year-old Ben Walker and wounding another. He went to the cafeteria and fired the remaining 48 rounds from the rifle, wounding 24 students and killing 17-year-old Michael Nicholson. When Kipland began to reload, one of the wounded students, Jacob Riker, tackled him, and he was assisted by several other students. Kipland drew a Glock from his belt and fired 1 last shot before he was disarmed, injuring Riker again. He yelled at other students to just kill me and end this. The students restrained Kipland until police arrived. A total of 7 students were involved in subduing and disarming Kipland. Once in police custody, Kipland retrieved a knife that was secured on his leg and attacked a police officer, wanting and begging to be fatally shot by that police officer. The police officer instead used pepper spray. How he was able to have a knife on him in police custody is beyond me. You would have thought they would have searched him down, and given the fact that he just committed this horrific crime, he would have had multiple police officers right there and searched every part of his body to ensure he was no longer a threat to himself or others. How this knife was missed is beyond me. But that seems to be the MO of this story. A lot of missed things, a lot of things that were not truthful that led to other unfortunate tragic events. Once he was in jail, Kipland was placed on suicide watch, and he attempted to kill himself by starvation, but stopped once his sister Kristen began visiting him. He did not resume the attempts after that. In his defense, Kipland was mentally ill, and that is the argument that he went with. The psychologist that had previously been seeing him said that he was in satisfactory mental health, and he had seen him for 9 sessions and treated him for major depression. Both William, his father, and Faith, his mom, were terminated from the therapy session because Kipland was responding well to the treatments and showed a cease of symptoms of depression. Again, 9 sessions. 9! Like, what the fuck? That is not enough. Someone does not get better in 9 sessions. That's when you just start to break through with the person. On September 24th, 1999, 3 days before the jury selection process was set to begin for his trial, Kipland pleaded guilty to the murder and attempted murder, foregoing the possibility of being acquitted for reasons of insanity. And in November of 1999, Kipland was sentenced to more than 111 years in prison without the possibility of parole. After the sentencing, Kipland apologized to the court for both the murder of his parents and the shooting spree that took place at the high school. In 2003, a permanent memorial was created and dedicated at the school in memory of the events. It has a curved wall with a plaque of the names of the 2 students killed. And originally it was going to include the names of Kipland's parents, but that was dropped after a hot topic debate, which I can understand. While even though they were involved in the tragic events, they weren't actually at the school campus. They weren't murdered at school, even though his father had previously taught at the school but had retired 3 years ago. I can understand not wanting their names on this plaque. And many of the students at the time still lived in Springfield, and Thurston's current dean of students, a friend who had called Kipland Kinkel to let her know what happened, considers this their 9/11. This shooting brings up so many questions. So many. What would have happened if they had received the proper treatment for his illnesses? If his family had been honest and actually disclosed everything to the psychologist? If the family friend would have done something to help? And why the hell would you give this child firearms and access to firearms? So many things with this case that would have made it better and prevented so much. Please let us know what your thoughts are about this case and the events that transpired in the comments below. Don't forget to check us out on all social media platforms, and of course, you can listen to our podcast anywhere you listen to your favorite podcast. Until next time, I'm Jace, and we hope to hear you back next week for another chilling episode of Bloodstained Backstories.